Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Corey and I are happy to be here today to share research we've been conducting about autistic women's employment experiences. And we're also going to talk about ways to create neuro-affirming inclusive workspaces. Moving my slides here. These were the learning objectives that were on the flyer, but we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Just for those who don't know me, I'm Yani Hamdani. I'm on faculty at the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at the University of Toronto, where I am today. But I'm also a scientist part-time at the Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Centre. And my research focuses very broadly on health, well-being, social inclusion, and participation of people labeled with neurodevelopmental disabilities such as autism. And I'll now turn to one of our research team members and advisors, Corey, to introduce herself. Oh, you're on mute, Corey.
You'd think by now, like all of us would have this down, but I'm Corey Hollemeyer. I have a master's degree in teaching, health services administration, human resources, and an MBA as well. My Bachelor of Arts degree is in anthropology. I'm currently working on my PhD in leadership and sustainability leadership and organizational development and change. I am focusing on what are the root causes of people's attitudes toward the environment. I have two autistic daughters, ages 7 and 9, and I was diagnosed myself in May of 2022 at the age of 45.
Thanks, Corey. So for our agenda today, I'm going to talk a little bit and set the stage with some sort of statistics and concepts that are relevant to our study. Then I'm going to provide an overview of our research on autistic women's employment experiences. And then I'm going to turn to Corey, who's going to discuss some practical application about creating neuro-affirming inclusive workspaces. Okay. So just to start off, when we look at the prevalence of a variety of diagnoses and conditions that fall under the umbrella term of neurodivergence, I think we can make a case as to why employers as well as educational institutions should care about making places inclusive. Broadly, there are two types of neurodivergence, genetic and acquired, and I'm not going to go through detail here, but just some highlights. The Center for Disease Control says that there's 1 in 44 people, or 2.2% of the population, are diagnosed with autism. About 13% are diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's also important to note that many women are not diagnosed with conditions such as autism and ADHD or are diagnosed later in life. And this has been attributed to many factors, such as research and diagnostic assessments have been created based mostly on the ways these conditions present for boys. And research has found that the ratio of diagnosis boys to girls has been anywhere from 5 to 1 boys to girls to 3 to 1. So this suggests that they're a woman and maybe other gender diverse people who are not identified or aware of their diagnosis. And so some of these numbers might actually be a little higher, and they may be having support needs that are not being met in school, in the community, and in workplaces. So these are conditions that affect people of all races, ages, genders, ethnicities. So it's important to consider the intersectional identities, such as gender and autism, as part of the equation when it comes to initiatives related to equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. So given this information, it only makes sense to take a universal or inclusive approach to workplaces. I've already started to use a little bit of this language, and many of you are probably familiar with these terms, but neurodiversity basically includes everyone. It's like the cognitive and neurological diversity among humans, among people. And a neurotype is an identifiable particular cognitive neurological way of being, whereas neurodivergent means belonging to a neuro minority, so not neurotypical, such as being identified as autistic or having ADHD. And neurodiverse is sometimes a word that can be confused with neurodivergent, and we'll just note that in some countries and places that they may use some of these words differently or interchangeably. But in general, neurodivergent means those who do not fall under neurotypical norms, which is the term more for like the more common mainstream or predominant cognitive or neurological styles that someone may have, and they're not necessarily identifying with another neurotype. As for language considerations, here are some examples of identity first and person first language that we take into account in our research. Most autistic people prefer using autistic person versus person with autism. Having said that, it's important to ask people what they prefer and to be respectful and use the language that they request. And likewise is the case for people with disabilities and disabled people. Many autistic people feel that the term disorder in autism spectrum disorder, as far as the diagnostic label, they find it insulting. For example, they may not feel disordered. Rather, they feel that society has not been built for their autistic ways of being and doing, and thus they experience discrimination because of that. And so generally, the most sensitive reference is to use the word autism. And then finally, to say that not all neurodivergent individuals identify as being disabled, and therefore it's best not to assume that neurodivergence or autism, that someone considers themselves as disabled. But of course, in order to get accommodations and supports that are necessary to participate in a world that's built for neurotypical ways of being and doing, it may be necessary for some people to use a disability label. And this is the case of a person who may feel disabled by their environment, which leads to talking about different models of disability, which we consider in our research. And the two most common are the medical and the social model. So the medical model of disability, which is generally most widely adopted in healthcare, proposes that disability is inherent in the person, that there's a biological, neurological, or psychological impairment or deficit that's in need of being treated or cured. In contrast, the social model of disability suggests that a person is disabled by their environment. And that's not only the physical aspects of the environment, like for example, for people with mobility differences, but also by societal expectations and attitudes about disability and difference. And there have been shifts in thinking about autism as disability in healthcare research and practice, towards thinking about autism as part of neurodiversity. And there's a growing interest in what constitutes a neuro-affirming approach to healthcare. And I would say that both ways of thinking, social and medical models, contribute to helping us understand the everyday life experiences of autistic people. But it's really important for us to collaborate closely with people with lived experiences to ensure that we're doing research about things that are important to them, such as employment. And then the final concepts I want to highlight are sex and gender, which are important to our research project today. They're viewed as different but interrelated concepts, and they can be difficult to untangle in research. But we do know that most autism studies on sex and gender do not clearly differentiate between the two. So as a starting point for our research, this infographic from CIHR, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, proposes that sex refers to the biological attributes of a person, whereas gender refers to socially created or constructed ideas about the behaviors, roles, and identities of women, men, and gender diverse people. And for our study, we were focused on the concept of gender. So now that we've kind of done a little bit of setting the stage of what our thinking is behind autism and sex and gender, I'm going to discuss our research project. And this was a study funded by SSHRC, or the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And we have a terrific team of researchers, trainees, advisors with lived experience, as well as people with experience of supporting and employing autistic people. In previous studies that I've been involved in to explore the healthcare experiences of autistic women, so not focused on employment, many of the women talked about struggles with maintaining employment. We know that employment participation is promoted as a social determinant of health, yet sustaining paid employment can be really challenging for autistic women. And research suggests that many autistic women also experience adverse social and mental health consequences through the work that they do in order to sustain employment. And there have been efforts recently in Canada to address this. Here I highlight a report from Western University on ableism in Canadian workplaces, and a guide from the Conference Board of Canada on breaking down barriers for neurodivergent employees, as well as an environmental scan on autism employment by CASDA, the Canadian Autism Alliance. And they're very helpful in directing attention to steps for supporting and creating accessible environments. However, there continues to be a gap in knowledge about what might be unique about autistic women's experiences, as well as gender diverse people. But our study focuses on autistic women, and we want to explore how work is experienced by them from their perspectives, and also to examine ideas or concepts of gender and autism and their intersection and how they come into play in workplaces, as well as exploring what workplace accommodations and supports might be helpful. So this was a qualitative study. It involved in-depth interviews with autistic women with paid employment experience and employers or employment support professionals who have experience working with autistic women employees. And we analyzed interview transcripts as well as interview memos that the interviewer wrote after each interview, writing down what insights or things related to gender or autism they heard in the interviews. And so we were attuned or sensitized to social constructions or ideas about gender and autism and their intersections and how that was reflected in the data. So to date, we've had 10 autistic women participate in interviews, and their age range was 31 to 54 years of age, and most were formally diagnosed, but later in life. 4 of 10 had a graduate university degree, and the others either had an undergrad degree or college or high school diploma. And at the time of the study, 3 were working full time, 3 were unemployed and looking, and 1 person was unemployed and not looking at the time. We also had 8 employment support professionals in our study. For the most part, they were people who were quite attuned to supporting autistic employees. And you can see by some of their job titles, they were employment coaches, neurodiversity coaches, support managers. We actually had some difficulty recruiting employers, and we're not quite sure why, but one reason may be that they're not as directly involved in planning or providing accommodations or supports, or perhaps they were in smaller businesses or workplaces and our recruitment efforts weren't reaching out. So for today, I'm going to focus on some of the unique or new things we learned about autistic women's employment experiences with a lens on how gender and autism were understood and discussed in the interviews. And a key idea across the participants' interviews, and stated either explicitly but sometimes indirectly, was that being and demonstrating work competence in relation to the notion of a normative worker was a very interesting idea. And this quote from Mary, who was one of the autistic women, encapsulates the idea. She talked about the world of work as being designed for the normative worker, which she described as able-bodied, cisgender, white male with a wife at home who does everything for him. So here she's suggesting that workplaces are embedded with normative ideas about the traits, characteristics, and behaviors of a proper worker or of proper work behaviors. And these assumptions and ideas, pose advantages for employees who fit or can approximate those behavioral norms, but could pose disadvantages to those who fall outside of those norms, such as autistic women. And this suggests that workplace contexts shape autistic women's employment experiences and also what counts as being competent at work. Sarah, who was another autistic woman in our study, talked about how her work competence could be called into question by colleagues and her employer, particularly when she decided to disclose her autism diagnosis. So this suggested that they held some underlying beliefs about autism and what it meant to be capable of performing work behaviors in relation to some implied standard for work competence. which led us to question, as research team, like, what is competency about? What's involved in demonstrating competence at work? There were two threads that we're going to discuss today, among others, that we think are important to review. So one thread involved navigating the stereotypes and the stereotypes and assumptions about autism. So much like the quote from Sarah in the previous slide, this played out in their social interactions with colleagues and supervisors and the range of reactions they received when they shared their autistic identity or diagnosis. Another thread involved navigating gendered social norms for behaviors. That is, navigating norms and socially expected ways for being and conducting oneself as a woman. And in the following slides, I'll share some examples of how these threads were represented in our data. So the autistic woman in our study discussed being confronted with stereotypes of autism based on ideas of autism for boys and men. For example, Chelsea here talked about challenges about her colleagues not believing her. She stated, like, a lot of the time it was a surprise, like the standard, oh, you don't seem autistic. And it's not that they wanted to offend her, but they also didn't really know what to do with the disclosure of that information. And Chelsea had been glad about her diagnosis because it helped her to understand herself and some of the challenges she had been experiencing, but suggested that her colleagues were unsure about how to respond to this as positive or negative. Likewise, Amy talked about how useful it would be to have an autism-informed workplace, a workplace that understands autism as more than, as she stated, little nonverbal white boy who screams all the time, that it can be adults who are autistic and people of all genders can be autistic. Thus, both Amy and Chelsea's statements highlighted their views on the lack of knowledge in workplaces about the many different and gendered ways that autism can present. Minna, who was an autism employment support professional, also discussed employers' reactions to autistic employees, such as them saying, oh, they're not that autistic, or they don't seem autistic, suggesting that employers held some preconceived ideas about autism. Minna also talked about masking or autistic women adopting strategies in order to align with behaviors that were socially expected or neurotypical ways of behaving, interacting, and conducting themselves in the workplace in order to avoid autism stigma. And so such strategies may have consciously or subconsciously developed in order to conceal autistic ways of being that they viewed as being received as unfavorable. Minna also went on to discuss the potential problem of masking for autistic women. She suggested that the energy and effort put toward masking and fitting in and not being able to be their authentic selves had consequences for their productivity, but also their health and well-being. So having said that, I do want to emphasize that masking can also be very helpful for many autistic people in some contexts. And all of us do work to manage impressions of ourselves, the way we act and behave in specific contexts. Much like I'm doing right now, I'm presenting in a particular way as a researcher in a research webinar presentation. However, autistic women, and maybe autistic people more broadly, may have more at stake, such as stigma and discrimination compared to non-autistic people if they cannot be their authentic selves. So Mary also discussed stereotypical expectations of how women should look and behave in society and how these expectations may play out for autistic women in workplaces. So for example, she suggested that a man's behaviors or conduct, such as setting boundaries, advocating for themselves, may be viewed as demonstrating leadership characteristics. In contrast, she suggested that women are socialized differently. For example, women are expected to be friendly, nice, and people pleasers, suggesting that these characteristics aren't necessarily associated with leadership. Mary continued to explain that people-pleasing may be a strategy that autistic women in particular may use to mitigate experiences of being rejected or excluded in workplaces. Several autistic women in our study discussed the social repercussions of breaking from gendered norms and expectations, such as being vocal about their autism and asking for accommodations and supports. So for example, Angela talked about struggling with the authoritarian management style of her manager, who was a man, when she was working in a corporate job. And when Angela confronted her manager about this, she described doing it in a way that was straightforward and speaking her thoughts. And Angela believed that speaking up in this way was uncharacteristic of a woman in her workplace, which kind of threw her manager off. And moreover, this advocacy did not lead to any changes or improvements for Angela. And what she suggested was that her autistic way of communicating did not line up with the social norms for a woman's way of communicating and behaving. And she continued to explain how her autistic traits also had consequences for burnout. So the manager in that same interaction suggested that he had hired her specifically to take on these work roles and responsibilities, suggesting that implying that she had competence to do these things and implying her an expectation to be competent. And as Angela explains in this quote, she really believed or took at face value this expectation of competence and then proceeded to engage in extraordinary effort to demonstrate and maintain work competence, which led to being burnt out eventually and eventually having to seek help and support. Thus, ideas about both gender and autism came into play in this interaction. So meeting expectations or even going beyond expectations for being the normative worker had implications for the health, well-being, and sustained employment for many of the autistic women in our study. So what might we do to create better work experiences for autistic women? We're continuing to analyze our data, but we have started to curate some ideas and recommendations for neuro-inclusive supportive workplaces. So first of all, a good person role workplace fit is important. And it's contextual. So that meaning the fit between the person and their interests and skills, as well as the expectations for the job role and responsibilities, and the fit with the workplace and space, so where it's arranged and the sensory and physical layout of the space. It's important to have clear communication about the roles and expectations and deliverables. And autistic women feel that workplace social culture is really important. So creating a sense of belonging and that it's okay to be different, and then different employees may be different things in order to do their work, and they may want to interact with colleagues in their own ways. And along those lines, autistic women talked about psychological safety and wanting to feel welcomed and valued in their own right in workplaces and being able to be who they are without judgment. It was really important to have support, or maybe important to have support for making disclosure decisions about autistic identities or diagnoses. And some of our autistic women made this decision for personal reasons. They were really proud of their autistic identities and how it explained their life experiences, where others made decisions for very practical, for professional reasons in order to get formal workplace accommodations. And then others decided not to disclose at all for risk of experiencing stigma or discrimination in that workplace. And then finally, having physical environments that address sensory considerations, whether it's lighting, smells, textures, is really important. And we've heard that from autistic people more broadly, as well as the importance of the physical space setup, such as open floor plans, which Corey's going to talk to you about, versus offices, versus setting up desks in ways that are away from the traffic flow of people, and also having a space to rest and fill your cup during the day. And our main point is to emphasize the importance and value of fostering neuro-affirming, and I would also say gender-affirming workplaces to support the health, well-being, and sustained employment for autistic women, but that these workplaces could have benefits for other employees as well. So I'm now going to turn to Corey, who will discuss some other practical ideas for getting started to support neuro-affirming workplaces. And Corey, you can just tell me when you need me to advance the slides.
Okay. The first practical application is sensory considerations, and the environment affects people from a sensory perspective, whether they're neurodivergent or not. And this is a largely neglected aspect of the workplace, the physical environment. And typically decisions are made based on costs or anticipated productivity benefits rather than consideration of physical or mental health effects. Next slide, please. As was mentioned in the discussion earlier, open floor plans can be quite disabling for some people. Many neurodivergent people have sensory sensitivities. This includes sound, light, and smells, among others. This is problematic from a physical and mental health point of view. This is also true of some neurotypical people. Since there are no physical barriers in an open office floor plan, they can be very loud due to talking and office machines being used, as well as the lighting is an issue because it can't be adjusted for individual preferences. An example of the light being disabling is more sensitive people can hear fluorescent lighting buzzing, or they see it kind of flickering, and the brightness of artificial light can lead to headaches and migraines in neurodivergent and neurotypical people. Smells can be problematic as they are able to diffuse through the entire area, and this includes food, perfumes, chemical odors from cleaning products. All of this can lead to a loss of focus and disrupted productivity, which can make a person look incompetent. In addition to sensory considerations from an environmental standpoint, open floor plans lead to more interruptions because people seem more available to talk. For neurodivergent people and some neurotypical people too, it can take time to get deeply focused into work. And when interruptions happen, it can be disorienting, and then it may take a lot of time for the interrupted individual to get back to the task that they were working on. People who are experiencing this type of sensory overload may look incompetent, as is kind of a theme here. I think it's important to point that out. It's for these reasons that work from home must be a reasonable accommodation for jobs that can be done at home. And the pandemic has proven how many jobs can be done from home very well. Next slide, please. The next practical application is talent acquisition and recruiting neurodivergent people. Move to the next slide. First of all, in the recruitment process, job descriptions and advertisements. These practices are not only helpful for neurodivergent people, but also helpful in getting more people who are qualified for a job to apply. Most job ads today are filled with paragraphs that are too long, run-on sentences, and a laundry list of requirements and duties that are practically like a wish list for Santa at Christmas. That's how I feel when I read some of them. So following a simplified process makes it easier for everyone who is seeking a job to understand what the organization is looking for. If your organization is specifically looking to increase the proportion of neurodivergent talent, then consider posting ads on social media and in groups that were created by neurodivergent people and specific groups for different types of neurodivergence if you want to get a variety. For the list that's on this slide, basically, there's just a few things to think about, and it's not hard at all. Just keep requirements to what's needed on day one. Just keep it simple. Keep requirements limited to 3 to 4 bullets and be concise. Clearly label preferences as not necessary. Make sure that people know it is a preference. It's not a hard pass if they don't have that. And limit preferences to 2 to 3 bullets at a maximum. Use very clear, simple, and direct language. Keep jargon to a minimum. Saying that a company is hiring a ninja or a rock star might sound cool to some people, but this can actually dissuade people who are both neurodivergent and neurotypical from applying. Alternate between bullets and short paragraphs. Limit paragraphs to 5 sentences for a job advertisement. Also use bolding or italics to break up the sections, which is helpful for people with dyslexia. Consider college degree requirements. Is it necessary for the job, or can the skills be learned elsewhere? Many neurodivergent people find navigating college to be too difficult, especially at the bachelor's level, because of the broad number of subjects that are studied, the reading load, and other challenges. However, many of these same people are quite intelligent and have taught themselves how to do these or have the skills that they need in alternative ways. So keeping the lines of communication open, even if it's to say that there is no news, is actually news. Say like no news is news. If you don't know where you're at in the process, just let people know, every week or so, like we're still working on it, because that really helps alleviate anxiety. Next slide, please. The job interview is typically the most difficult part of the process for neurodivergent job candidates to get through after getting through, if they can even get through the resume sorting process, which is a challenge for pretty much everyone looking for a job, but even more so for autistic people. Like with autism, as an example, consider the diagnostic criteria of autism, which includes social communication differences and differences in relating to others. This, along with neurotypical interviewer expectations that of a standard interview, means that autistic people would be at a significant disadvantage right from the start. Many interviewers probably do not know how to interpret some things that autistic people may do, which would include like repetitive movements, like opening and closing hands. And when autistic people are stressed out, they might do this more. Not answering questions in the expected manner can happen. Going off on what seems like an unrelated tangent can occur, but it's because autistic people think differently. They make connections other people don't. So it seems unrelated, but it's related to them and in their way of thinking. So another thing is wearing unexpected interview attire is possible, and that's because of sensory sensitivities. They might not be able to tolerate some of the clothes that are considered under that normative professional ideal, or whatever you want to refer to it as. In addition, reduced affect may also be judged negatively, and affect being how expressive the person is through nonverbal communication or tone of voice. And that can be especially an area where women would be dinged in an interview, because women are expected to be, very social, very comforting, very nice, and not communicate necessarily in a very direct way. So that's ways where women are at even more of a disadvantage. And one way to make the process better, more informative, and more comfortable for everyone involved, like not just neurodivergent, but also neurotypical people, would be to provide the questions that will be asked of candidates ahead of time. And this will give people time to process the information and give a well thought out response. This helps autistic people to truly demonstrate their competence, because autistic people generally need a little bit of time to think, and they think more deeply on the topic. So if the job requirement requires people to be able to answer tough questions on the spot, then that's obviously a different story. But many jobs do not require this kind of ability. Therefore, it doesn't make sense to withhold the questions from people who will not need this skill. And it's also important to consider whether observed behaviors really matter for the role in question. If the person's going to be working independently by themselves at a computer and they flap their hands, it doesn't really, is that going to hurt anybody? Is that going to hurt the business? And the important thing here is to build up the diversity of your organization. And the efforts that are made for neurodivergent people help make things better for everyone. The reason for this is because neurodivergent people are what my friend calls canaries in the coal mine, and they're the best indicators of things that may be challenging for all people. Okay, next slide, please. And so the last thing we're going to look at is how to manage neurodiverse teams. And we can pretty much assume, like based on those statistics that we looked at, that every team is a neurodiverse team. So starting on that assumption, Managing neurodiverse teams mostly comes down to very good communication and leadership skills. It's also necessary to understand what kinds of challenges people may be facing and the individual supports that each employee needs to be most successful in the role as they can be. Rather than asking people to disclose for simple accommodations, doing things the right way in a universal manner is more helpful. Unless a person needs a substantial accommodation like missing work every Friday for therapy, for example, there should be no need for a person to disclose. And this allows people to maintain privacy. In addition, we spoke about the number of people who are not even identified or aware of their neurodivergence. Some people will not disclose, as Yani said, because they don't want the stigma. And I mean, I totally understand that. If I was just meeting someone, I would not disclose in general. I mean, I do these talks, but I still don't just disclose upon meeting people. So there's a lot more to managing neurodiverse teams and meetings than what is on the slide, but these are some points to get started. And while this may seem elementary, how often do these things really happen at your organization? And when they don't happen, it affects the neurodivergent the most negatively. So first of all, have an agenda prepared and shared 24-hour in advance for meetings. If it's an emergency, just try to take 5 minutes and make something quickly so that people can start thinking. And that way people can come prepared to intelligently speak about the topic at hand. Next, start on time. Give each person, I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. Give each person the floor for a set amount of time, because some people, as we all know, will talk in the meeting and talk the entire time. And then there's other people who don't know when it's their turn to talk. Offer each person the opportunity to speak without making it feel mandatory to do so, because that both situations could be uncomfortable. And it's especially important for women who are generally socialized to be more polite and not interrupt. And intersectionally autistic women would be even more uncertain. Like, I know I'm frequently in a meeting, like people are talking, someone won't stop talking. I'm like wondering when it's my turn just to make an important point. So in addition, it's important to follow up a meeting with a quick email outlining the decisions that were made and decisions that were tabled. List who's accountable for implementation of specific parts, and allow this email to be a place for people to add additional thoughts that they had after the meeting is over, because then it can serve as a continuing conversation. And also it provides a written form of communication, which sometimes autistic people prefer. And meetings on time, schedule meetings to end at the 25 or 55 mark, so people have time to get up and do something if they need to, or kind of switch gears mentally. Because, you know, in this world now, we've got one meeting stacked up after the other. And if we could just have that 5 minutes in between, I think everyone would be better off to have some time to reset. And these are simple changes to implement that can help make meetings more productive and employees happier and more engaged. On the next slide, please. So in summary for the practices, just have an open mind. Anything that you do to help neurodivergent employees will help everyone, because clarity helps us all. And I have a saying that I made up, and it's just that minds are like fingerprints and each one is unique. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you for providing some practical tips. I think many on this call know about some of them, but it's always good to review, and there's some new ones, and we can think about our practices even at the Azrieli Centre and ways that we can improve at CAMH as well to make places more neuro-inclusive. So we just want to acknowledge and thank our study participants for the insights and experience they shared with us. And we're continuing to finish up analyzing our data and hopefully come out with some papers and some practical recommendation and guides. And I think we're going to stop there to see if anyone has questions for us or any insights or comments for us to consider. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks so much, Corey and Yani. That was fantastic. And some of your practical advice really hit home. It's nice. Sometimes we hear research presentations and sometimes we hear kind of practical presentations. But I think the two of you really beautifully brought those two things together. And I feel like we need to share some of this, not just with our center, but probably across CAMH. So thanks for starting us off. And I am going to try for us to have a few minutes to go between this to what we're doing next. So maybe if you have a question, I will stop talking because I'm going to talk a long time. Raise your virtual hand online, and in the room, raise your hand so we can see how many people have questions or comments.
And yeah, we're happy to hear comments, or if something kind of surprised you or you thought was interesting, and just having a comment versus necessarily feeling you have to ask us a question, because it will help us think about our analysis a little bit more.
Simply wanted to just echo what Yona said, how super important. And I really hope that you do take this more broadly, because everybody in the world needs to know this. And this is so much the work that we do with our mindfulness groups, all this stuff that seems so obvious to us. And it's just like human decency to practice inclusion. But the fact that you have broken it down to all of these wonderful, beautiful little components for employers to think about in the interview process and the environment. And I love what Corey was sharing about the challenges like of an open workplace environment, right? That there's a lot of barriers involved in that. So honestly, I'm just seeing a huge, massive, and as the mom of an autistic son, thinking about the future as we move ahead, how we really want to make sure that we've got an inclusive world, right? So way to go. And I agree with you on it, just so beautifully presented. And thanks for doing this work. And it needs to be amplified way beyond just the research community.
I'm echoing everything that's been said so far. Such a great presentation. I'm just thinking about some of the employers or employment professionals that you spoke to. And I'm wondering if, because I immediately am going straight to the practicalities of like, what would a resource for an employer look like, or what would actually be useful in a work environment to help support change and to help move in this direction. I'm wondering if you heard anything from them about what the barriers might be to making these changes, or what would be useful in a really like practical way to try and make some of this happen.
Sure, I can go ahead, and Corey, if you want to add anything. So as I said about our the people representing sort of the employment side tend to be people already quite attuned to autism. So we weren't really hearing from employers themselves, or people who may not be as familiar with autism. So I think one of the biggest takeaways was, particularly in our current context where there seems to be so much interest on equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, that autism and disability is often, overlooked, or it's, the accessibility part. And that's why people add EDIA to it. The accessibility part is often overlooked, or sometimes it bends a little more towards like mobility or physical disabilities. So I think it's, first of all, addressing some of those threads that I talked about understanding and training and information, which is starting to get out there about the different ways autism may present, and sort of, I guess, the destigmatization of autism as well, which I know many of us are part of that, but also thinking about how we would take that up before people get to employment. So even thinking as healthcare providers, even when people are seeking a formal diagnosis, how do we talk about autism or offer them alternative framings of autism and as identity and what that means? And so that conversation is happening from school age and beyond, in everyday spaces. So I think, the main thing I remember hearing from the employer side interviews was they were really trying to dig into the EDIA side of things, since there seems to be a real trend towards that right now. So what they see as an opportunity to highlight embracing difference, including neurodiverse diversity.
Thanks, Yani.
Welcome.
I will add one small comment. I can't comment on the Canadian context because it's a little bit different. Obviously, it's like a circus here right now.
Oh,
So
I guess, Corey, did we say that you're in Pittsburgh?
no, I'm in Pittsburgh. So we have this, nail biter coming up of an election, which can only hope will go the right way. There's only one right way for it to go. Anyway, I think workplaces in the US, probably a lot of them in Canada too, are only interested in what's making changes that are going to be profitable for them. If they don't see what's the return on investment in making a change, they're not likely to not make the change. So unfortunately, even though there's the moral case for just doing what's right and, giving everyone a chance, you have to make a business case, and that, some people are trying to do that for innovation and just having neurodiversity of thought in a company can be very profitable.
Thank you. I'm seeing a lot of really nice feedback in the chat box. I don't know if you've opened it up, Yani and Corey, but I don't see any hands on the virtual side, and it's 12:55. So I think we should be good to what you told us today. We know how to get in touch with you. If you have more comments and questions, we can reach out directly. And we've also made a recording of this, so we'll share it for folks who've missed it. But thank you very much. Thanks everyone in person and online. Next month's talk, carrying on this theme around, supporting, neurodiverse workspaces. We're going to be hearing from Mary Doherty around healthcare, supporting autistic and neurodivergent people. So we'll see you in a month.